Let's start by laying down our horizon line. So this is a line that defines the far out distance where the where the sky and the ground meet. And we laid down very light because we'll have other elements that will go over. It's just always good to have it in a light line. So the next step will be to define the tree trunks that are on the ground. And what I will do for this tutorial is to have a trunk right over here. So this is a bit closer to the viewer, so it's a bit bigger. So again, as I've described in other tutorials, the tree trunks, as they go out in the distance, they become smaller. So that's the perspective. Things when they go out in the distance, they become smaller. So let me put down a smaller tree trunk in the distance. So this, this trunk is closer to the horizon, so it's smaller. It's further out, so I will make it into a smaller size. I will add one more trunk over here. And again, this is a bit bigger. So this is somewhere, in between this and this. So the size of this trunk is bigger than this, but smaller than this because it's, it lies somewhere between the two trunks. And what I will do is to put down a bigger trunk right over here. So this is closest to the viewer, so it will be bigger in size as well. So this will be the closest and hence the biggest trunk in our drawing. And what I like to do is to always have a path that is leading somewhere. So that really, makes drawing a lot more interesting and it catches the viewer attention so their eyes can travel the path. So let's lay down a simple path. It's always good to do it initially in the dotted line, and once you like it, then you can make it more darker. And the path goes in the distance. So again, as you can see, what is happening is that as the path goes out in the distance, it becomes smaller in size. So then, there's a simple path I put down. And now once we are happy with this layout, I can darken it. So this is the kind of path that goes out to the distant horizon in our simple drawing. So there we have it. So now we have, a simple path that is leading out towards the horizon and 4 trunks. And what I will also do for this drawing is to add some of these wooden structures. So these are essentially more like a fencing that you can, think of it. And again, what happens is that, as the fencing goes out in the distance, it will become smaller in size. So I have one fence over here, and then this fence is closer to the viewer, so I'll make it a bit bigger in size over here. And then over here, I'll have a yet smaller fence. So these are the 3 fences that we draw in our drawing. So let's now start to put texture into our drawing. So the first thing that we will do is to create the barks for these tree trunks. And for the trunks that are not too close, for example, these 3 trunks, the simplest stroke to use to create the bark texture is these angular crossing lines. So by using these lines, you can create a simple bark texture. So let me start by adding these lines to this trunk. And as you can see, these are angular, so they are not parallel. So they are not parallel, but they're a little bit at an angle and they intersect each other like this. So what I do initially is to lay down one layer of these lines on this trunk. Now, the other important thing to keep in mind is that to bring out the roundness of the trunk, we need to make one end darker than the other. So we will leave this end lighter. So I have not really put down any line at this very end, but I will add more lines to the other end to make it darker. So I'm using the same stroke, but I'm adding more lines at the end. And as you can see, what happens is that as I add more lines, it becomes darker, and that brings out the roundness of the trunk. So essentially, for any rounded object, one end which is in shadow, which is in shade, is always darker than the other. So we have to always, have the change of tone from dark to the light to bring out the roundness. And I do it for this trunk by simply adding those lines more at one end, and I leave the other end light. The other thing I will do is to make the edges a bit jagged. So essentially, when you draw a trunk, you draw it like this. But to make it more believable, it's always good to add a bit more of, this jaggedness like this, simply add some darkness like this. And that makes, a bit more realistic depiction of the trunk outline. So that's what I will do here. So I will simply add this jaggedness over here to give it a bit more feel for the bark and the trunk at the edges. And I'll do the same over here at the other end as well. So as you can see, simply by adding a bit of this dark, it gives a bit of, jagged feel, and makes it more believable as a trunk. And one more thing that you can also do is to add a bit more crevices, something like this, kind of tapered crevices to the trunk as well, to give it a bit of trunk feel, bark feel as well. So I added some more in darker crevices as well. So this essentially completes our this trunk, and I'll use the same stroke in this trunk as well to texture it. So I'll go ahead and again use these angular lines over here. And what I will do is to again also darken it at one end more than the other. So as you see, what essentially happens with this angular stroke is that, when these lines are intersecting, they leave some white in between, and that, gives a feel of bark that is in light in that trunk. So essentially, these intersecting lines, they give a feel for bark at a distance. And I again, darken one end more than the other, and I will again, create the edges a bit jagged over here as well. So I define, this trunk and this bark in the same manner. For the trunk that are further out, I mean, essentially, I don't really have that much space over here to create this kind of, change of tone. So what I do for this trunk is to simply create a bit of, darkness over here. I just simply add a jagged darkness. So again, I'm not creating a uniform darkness, but kind of, I'm just adding the darkness. And the other edge, I will also make it a bit rough. So that essentially completes the trunks that are far out in the distance. You have this trunk, and what you do is simply, add a bit of darkness. So this defines the roundness. It brings out the roundness of the trunk. So we are done with this trunk. Now for the trunks that are up close, we want to show a bit more of the detailed bark texture. So essentially, this technique of this angular lines is good to give an overall feel for the bark. But for the trunks that are up close, we want to, show a bit more detail. And the way we do it is by first initially laying out the bark outline. So to show more bark details, what you need to do is to create this kind of outline for the bark. And again, there are many different shapes that you can use for this bark outline. The shape that I will use for this tutorial is a bit of elongated bark shape. So to show bark details, I essentially first draw those individual bark pieces that you will see, if you were to go up close to a trunk. So essentially, first step is to draw a bark outline like this. And again, you can use different shapes. You can have a bit more rounded shape like this, or you can even have, a bit more elongated shapes like this. So by using different shapes, you can essentially, create a different feel for the bark. So the first step is to create these pieces. And the other thing to notice is that at the edges, I make, pieces smaller. So essentially the biggest pieces are in the center, and towards the edges, the pieces that become small. And this is again because of perspective. Those things at the edges, they will look smaller than the pieces that are in the center, which are the biggest. So do that as well. And once we create the bark outline, what we will do next is to shade these bark pieces individually. And again, the thing to keep in mind is to again vary their tone. So for example, if this is the bark piece, then you will make one end darker than the other. So here I just darkened one end and I left the other almost white. So you can do that as well. So you leave one end white and just darken the other edge. And this will bring out that roundness again of that bark piece and give it a bit more realistic feel. So that's what I will do. I will again, add a bit of darkness to one edge. So I'm just using these parallel lines like this, but you can use, other strokes like, for example, marks or something like that. Any kind of stroke that will give a feel for bark. But again, the important thing to notice is that I'm leaving this end white. So I'm not darkening the bark completely, but over here, so for example, I will always leave a layer of white at the other end to give it a feel of, curvature. So that's what I do. Even for the smaller pieces, I'm careful to leave that white at the other end. And as you're doing it, you can see that, it starts to get a feel of roundness. So you can continue doing the same thing. And again, you can use a lot of different strokes, and use of different stroke and the shape for different bark outline will give an entirely different feel for the bark. So you can experiment using different strokes and using different bark outlines to see which ones you like. So here, here this is the way that you can actually show more bark details. So essentially, in these strokes, in these trees, using this angular stroke, we get an overall feel for bark, but we don't really see bark pieces as such. But as we get closer to a tree, we're able to see more detail, and which is why the trunk is also bigger, and in the bigger size of the trunk we can draw these bark details as well. And as I'm adding the darkness or the texture to the bark, I'm leaving one end white, just like I did for the trunk. So in the trunk, essentially I treated the whole trunk as one, and I darkened one end and left the other one lighter. For the detail bark texture, I'm treating each piece as separate, and I'm darkening one end, and like this, for example, darkening one end and leaving out the other one. So here, for example, if to show you more, I will darken this and leave out the other end, and for this piece I'll darken this. So there's a transition, there's a dark, light, and this transition kind of gives a feel for the roundness of the bark texture. So there we have it. So we now are done with this tree that is up close as well. So essentially now we have the trees done, and what I will do next is to essentially define or texture these posts as well. And the way to texture the post is same, using this angular line. So you can think of the post as kind of tree trunk in a distance, and we will use the same texturing for those posts as well. And again, I will make one end darker than the other, so I will make this end darker. So as you can see, this is a very generic all-purpose stroke for texturing any kind of bark, so because this gives darkness and there is some white in between, that gives the feel for something in there, or a kind of bark texture. The other thing to do for the post is to always also darken the edge, the top. The top is a little bit old rotting wood, so it's always good to kind of darken it over here. So that's what I just did over here, and over here I'll do the same for this one as well. And for the far out post, I simply again darken the one end. So anything that is far out and then you don't have enough space to kind of create the tone variation, what you do is simply darken one end like this, and that gives a feel for the roundness. And then you always remember to leave a little bit of white in the center, so this darkness, white, and then a bit of darkness on the other end, that gives a feel for the curvature. So I do the same thing over here as well. So those three wooden posts are defined, or that their texturing is done. Now the next thing is to ground these trunks and the wooden posts. So essentially, if we leave them like this, the ground is not defined yet for us. So what I will do is to use grass to ground the trunks. And a simple way to ground them is to use a very short angular grass stroke like this. So using this stroke, you can give an impression of, a bunch of, or a clump of grass at the bottom of the trunk, and that serves to kind of, ground this trunk. So let's start doing it for this trunk over here. And again, these are short angular, short slightly curved lines like this, Don't make them too big, just make them small, and as you add more of them, they start to get dense and give a feel for a clump of, or thick clump of grass at the bottom of the trunk, which serves to ground it to the ground. So there we have it, so I use this grass to ground this trunk, and I'll use the same stroke to ground these other trunks as well. See, so you can see the difference that an ungrounded trunk and a grounded trunk makes. By grounding it, they look much more natural, and it really makes a drawing look more realistic. So I will ground this other trunk as well. And I will do the same with this close-up trunk as well. Now the other thing to notice is that as we get closer to the viewer, we want to use a bigger stroke for grass as well. So this over here, I use a smaller stroke, but for this trunk I'll use a bit bigger stroke like this. But it's the same stroke, it's an angular line. You can either use small or you can use a bigger one. So I'll use a bit bigger angular lines over here to indicate grass, and ground this big trunk as well. So there we have it, and I can do the same to ground our wooden posts as well. So to ground any object to the ground, use this simple grass stroke to make them feel that they are in the ground, properly anchored. So I'll do the same for this post, and again as I'm going out in the distance, I'm using a bit smaller stroke as well. So there we have it. So now we have, 4 trunks and 3 wooden posts textured. The next thing that we will learn in this tutorial is to draw the distant foliage. So in any landscape, you will draw your elements that are a little bit closer to the viewer, but it always feels nice to have something in the background that that the eyes can travel to. So this is the path, and right now there's nothing that the eyes can rest at as they go out in the distance, and the simplest thing to add is a distant foliage. So let's add a distant foliage, that shows that there is something out in the distance, and the easiest way to do it is to use a parallel lines like this. But what I will do in this tutorial is to actually create a bit more interesting distant foliage. And the way we do it is by using something like this, a stroke with a small open loops. This kind of loop and the shape, the shape is a little bit, rounded like this. So it's not fully round, but, something like that. And these small loops, they give the feel of a distant foliage. So here I start using these loops to create, a shape like this. So as you can see, they're not all the same size, but I'm varying their size, and I'm also putting a bit of layers, so I have one layer and then on top I put another layer. And the layers at the top are smaller, so the ones at the base are the biggest, and the layers at the top, they get smaller. So if I want to put one more layer, I will put it even smaller than the one below it. So again, the basic stroke to use is something like this, and then add a bit more layer on top to define the distant foliage. So this looks nice, and what we can do now is to add some shading to it to give it a bit more concrete form. And the way we do it is by using these angular lines inside of this foliage. And if you notice, what I'm doing is something similar to what I did for our trunks, which is to leave one end white, lighter than the other, except the lighter end is at the top of this foliage. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm darkening the end and leaving a layer of white at the top, and then again darkening the other layer above it. So this white that I leave at the top, also serves to differentiate between the two layers of foliage as such. So again, over here I will darken and then leave a layer of white at the top. Same, I will darken and leave a layer of white at the top. So that's what I will do for this distant foliage. So again, I darken the bottom but leave a layer of white, and then I darken the second layer above it like this. So always, the key thing to remember always is that anything that is rounded or has some kind of curvature is not flat. There has to be a change in the tone, in the lightness and the bright darkness across its surface to give it that feel. And that's what we have to always remember and follow in any landscape. So for a tree trunk, that means changing the tone from dark to light across the trunk. For a foliage, it usually means changing the tone from the bottom, which is darker, to the top, which is lighter. So that's what I do over here, after I've drawn that outline. And also the other thing to remember is to always use this kind of rounded strokes to define the outline. Never use a stroke like this, because if you use a hard line, then it destroys the effect of foliage. So by using simple loops and using this kind of shapes, it gives a feel of foliage. It's open, airy feel that you get for the foliage by using these strokes. So always use these strokes to define your background foliage, distant foliage, or even the tree foliage. So there we have it. It's almost done. And again, I'm shading each piece individually, leaving a layer of white at the top and then darkening the bottom of the layer above it, and that creates that white layer separation between the different layers. And that also, so this white does two purposes. One, it gives a roundness to the piece and second, it also serves to differentiate between the different pieces so they don't blend into each other. And also, the pieces at the top are smaller than the one at the bottom. Again, this is because of perspective, because the pieces at the top will be a bit more further out, and that also gives us that feeling of distance. So there we have it, a simple effective distant foliage we just drew. And one more thing that you can do actually is to add another layer of distant foliage behind this one, so that will even look nicer. It will add a bit more of charm to the drawing. And the way that you can do it is to use these angular lines. So these angular lines, they indicate that something is in the distance. It doesn't really tell a viewer what it is, but that's the whole point of the distant foliage, is that you want to give an impression of something at the back, but it might not necessarily be clear as to what it is. So let's go ahead and use that. So what I will do is these simple lines. I will draw as coming out from behind this first layer of the distant foliage. So essentially now we have two layers of distant foliage. This is in the front, and then this second layer at the back. So even the front has a layers, the front foliage has different layers of its own, but then we also have a second texturing of the distant foliage behind the front one. So the thing to notice is, again, I have a bit organic shape for the foliage. So again, the organic shapes are always something like, something like this. You will never have a flat, a flat shape like this, or a simple, curve like that. So always, use something like this, a kind of up and down kind of shape, because that's the shape that you will normally find in nature. And what I will do is to also darken the bottom of this second foliage as well. So again, what happens is that the base of the top is always lighter than the area below it. So I will do the same for this foliage as well. So here I will just add more lines to darken it. And what that does is that it also gives a feel of in a way volume, because if you have a uniform tone, then it's not clear if it is a flat or what it is. But by adding a bit more darkness and having a change of tone for this foliage, from darker to the lighter, again it gives the viewer the impression that it has a bit more density, a form to it. So I will again add a bit of darkness to the bottom of the second layer. So again, by adding a bit of darkness at the, and then if you want, you can extend it a bit more. So there we have it. So again, when you see this over here, this is dark and this is light, so it's giving the impression that here it is dense, as it goes towards the ground, and the top is lighter because it is receiving more sunlight. So that gives a nice volume to this second distant foliage as well. So that's done. So now we have a nice, first foliage which has its own layers, and then we have a second foliage, even further out, that serves to kind of, anchor the eye. So as our eyes travel towards his path, then they rest at this distant foliage, and then they enjoy that view. Now let's complete the ground. So essentially, to complete the ground, we first need to define the ground form. And by that I mean that you need to define how the ground is. Is it round, is it flat? And what the easiest way to do that is to use these horizontal lines like this. So that's what I will add. So essentially this indicates that our ground is kind of flat. But the other thing to notice is that the lines further out are smaller and they become bigger towards the viewer. So again, over here I'll show you what I mean. So as I'm coming closer to the viewer, I'm making them bigger. And what this is doing is to reinforce the notion of distance. So essentially, when anything goes out and becomes smaller in the distance, our eyes, perceive that, because of perspective, and it reinforces the notion of distance to our eyes. So over here, by using these parallel horizontal lines that are reducing in size with the distance, the viewer, gets the feel for distance in this drawing. And this also serves to define the ground form as well. So I will do that as well. And you can essentially add them wherever you have space and just increase them in size towards the viewer. So I add some more of these lines over here. So there we have it. And you can essentially even add different sets of lines, and they will, essentially together define the ground form that we have. So now you can see that, by adding those lines, now there's a bit more concrete definition of the ground. So the way, these lines are, curved gives the ground a form. If I wanted to, give a bit rounded form, I would, use curved lines like this. That will define a ground that is again curved. But here, we just have a flat ground, so I use these flat lines. But again, I reduce their size, and in distance they become smaller, so that they gives the notion of distance to the viewer. And the next step will be to then finally, define the grass or the ground cover. So for this tutorial, I will simply, cover them with grass. And again, the grass stroke is again this kind of slightly curved lines. And the thing to notice also is that the grass in the distance will be smaller. So for the smaller grass, I will use the smaller strokes. And as they come closer to the viewer, I will start increasing their distance like this. So as you can see, the grass in the distance is much smaller, and as it's getting closer to the viewer, it's getting bigger. So I'll use that same concept, and for the distant grass I will draw it very small like this over here. And as I get closer to the viewer, I increase the size. So I'll show you how it's done over here. So as I get closer to the viewer, I am increasing my size. And all these simple things, they are reinforcing the whole notion of distance in our drawing and giving it depth. So these are small things to keep in mind, but they do add overall in the end to give a nice feeling of distance in our drawing, which is the main component of any landscape, is to have a good depth in the drawing that the eyes can travel and enjoy. So that's what I did. I added bigger grass towards the viewer, and as you can see, that there's a change in the size of the grass blade stroke with the distance. And also, other thing to keep in mind is that we literally don't cover the whole ground with the grass. We need to give a suggestion for the ground being covered with grass, but that suggestion is enough, right? So once you add grass and you get the feel, then you can stop. You don't have to literally cover all the ground. So that's what I'm doing. I'm adding a bit of grass over here, a bit over here, changing my size with the distance. But in the end, just by adding a few strokes, we get a feel for the ground as being grass covered. And I will do the same over here. And again, over here, I will use a bit bigger strokes as well. And here in the distance, I'll use smaller strokes. And here, I will use a bit bigger strokes towards the viewer. So smaller strokes, and as I get towards the viewer, I start to use bigger strokes. And again, I'm not covering the whole ground with grass, but a simple suggestion is enough to give a feel of the ground as being grass covered. And in the last step, what we will do is to create some kind of definition for the path. So right now the path is white, and it doesn't really kind of, looks that nice. So we will use the same thing that we did for the ground, and I will add these horizontal lines in one end. And again, I'm not extending it all the way, but I'm just using it on one end. And again, I'm kind of, decreasing the size of these lines with the distance. And then what you can do is to add some kind of ground cover, or like a small white flower on this path to give it more interest. And the way you add a white flower is to use a stem and then just draw around and then add some dark over here. And then always ground the flower with a small dotted line. So again, the flower, you draw around, add some black, draw a stem, and then ground the flower. So you can, do them like this. And again, what you will do is, you will reduce their size with the distance. So as we are closer, we can have a bit more bigger stem. And as you go out in the distance, we again reduce their size over here. And you can add some grass as well. So here we'll have, much smaller flowers over here. And you can add some more closer to the viewer, a bit bigger. And then you can add some grass as well, surrounding these flowers to give it a nice feel as well. So there we have it, in a very quick simple landscape we completed. Oh sorry, one last thing we can do is to also connect these posts or fences by a wire, right? So what I did is to simply create a black line to connect them, and this gives a, so this completes the fence as well. So there we have it, a simple landscape we put together. So essentially in this tutorial we learned how to draw the bark texture for the trees that are in the middle ground and in close up, and we learned how to draw the distant foliage. So essentially there are two ways. One way is to use these loops to create the outline and then shade them, and then you can also use the parallel lines in the distance to create a second layer of distant foliage. And then finally we also drew the ground cover and covered it with grass. So there you have it, a simple pleasant landscape that you can put together in under 20 minutes and enjoy doing it. Thanks, bye bye.